What if your soul wasn't just one thing, but many? Today, we're uncovering the Norse Soul Complex, an ancient framework from our sources that explores the multifaceted nature of the self, encompassing the mind, heart, luck, and spirit. Let's see what the ancestors understood about who we really are. Welcome back to Fireside Frith, a hearth for Norse pagans and the curious alike. I'm Susanna, Wandering Star, a kindred leader in local Githya, here to share stories, wisdom, and real talk about living our path today. Whether you're a longtime heathen or just curious about Norse spirituality, you're in the right place. If you've been watching this podcast, you may notice my office changed again. It does not have flowers and leaves everywhere, so you know why you guys are looking at my workshop. Basically, I had a surgery right after my husband deployed, and we had someone babysit our dogs for some months until I healed up. So I have the dogs back. You can see there's a dog kennel next to Theodore and Frederick, my skeletons, because you know it's spooky season. It's October, so they're out. And if you guys have been watching the show for a while, you know I have 5 cats. I'm sure they've all been featured on the YouTube channel, so you might see them more often. This one has turned his back on me. He's upset that the light is still on and it is super late at night because I procrastinated writing this script. But anyway, that's why I had to move my office, because I was trying to record episodes and my dogs would just cry outside of the office door. They were just like, why did you abandon us again? So I have to be in here with them when I'm working. The workshop is here. This is where I make all my things that I make. If you're curious about that, just comment or message me, or you can email me at podcast@theozatruecommunity.com. Now that that's out of the way, you guys can see where I spend like 10 to 12 hours a day, if not more, who knows. Anyway, as I said in the intro, today we are talking about the Norse Soul Complex. I do want to apologize and give you guys a little disclaimer because I am changing the format of how I run Fireside Frith. There's going to be a lot more episodes like this. So please leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify if you like this or if you don't like this. I'm not bringing in a guest today. I'm not doing an interview. We're not talking about holidays. Today we're talking about a concept. The Northern Soul Complex, or the Norse Soul Complex, or the Norse Soul Matrix. You might have heard it be called any of those things. And that being said, I won't have a guest. It's just gonna be me talking. And because I have ADHD really bad and I tend to squirrel a ton, I wrote a script. So I will be reading from the script. Otherwise, I will just ramble and then it won't be productive. And will anyone actually learn anything or get anything out of this podcast? Maybe you'll just think I'm funny. Maybe I'm not funny and I only think I'm funny. Before we get into today's topic, I just want to let you guys know that I'm going to let you know what all my sources were at the end. Otherwise, I'll get confused as to which ones I have told you about and which ones I haven't. Anyway, let's get into this episode. Another disclaimer, I'm American and I am flawed and I will mispronounce things. But, you know, I know what the things mean. I might not say it correctly, but that's okay. I hope you guys are okay with that. But anyways, I'm going to get into this episode right now. We're going to start with part 1. This is going to be the historical roots. So, where do we get the idea of the multiple parts of the soul in Norse lore? Well, it is mentioned in both the prose and the poetic Edda. They have similar stories, but the names are different. That doesn't mean that they're contradictory. Different tribes back in the day, back in pagan times, they might have called things different names. So we don't really know that for sure. Sure, maybe it was contradictory, but also maybe they were just different names for the same beings. In the prose and the poetic Edda, it mentions the only difference is one, the story starts with Odin, Vili, and Ve. The other one is Odin, Honir, and Lothar. They get these 2 logs and they decide that they are ashen elm or askenambla. You know, they're trees with names. They're just logs. And at this point, they decided to give them gifts so that they can have a consciousness. They already had a form. They just decided to give them gifts. I can't remember the exact reason why, but I wonder if they had the foresight to what humanity has done to the planet, if they would still want to give us those gifts. Anyway, this is why we write a script, so I don't squirrel. We already existed as trees, like Ents if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, except we didn't have sentience. These three gods gave us these gifts to make us more godlike, or as Aritharger says, more whole. Odin, he gave the gift of Ond, meaning spirit, or more or less the breath of life. Honir gave Hugr, which is thought and understanding, more intellectual brain stuff. And then Lothar gave Hammer, which is the thing that makes us more godlike. It has to do with our senses and emotions. So before I get into exactly what all of these different things mean on a deeper level, I just want to say that in Christianity, they believe that the soul is housed in the physical body, and upon death, the soul separates and ascends to their final judgment day situation. I only bring that up because so many people are familiar with it. It is one of the more popular religions, even though in recent years there is a decline in it, but still most people understand the concept of Christianity. So it's an easy one to compare to. The major difference between this belief and that of Norse pagans is that in ancient times, there was no separation between the soul and the body. They are facets of the same entity, which is you and me and everybody else. So there's that. That was a little bit of a historical context from our mythos and our lore. I was sent this really cool blog article by Clara McGowan. She's a writer. She has some really cool stuff on her website. So if you just look her up, or the link will be in the show notes, she has some really cool stuff. Anywho, I'm just gonna summarize the article that I read, and just so you know, the following summary is not entirely about the Norse soul, but it helps paint a picture of all the complex parts of the soul and how we are more than just a singular spirit. So the name of the blog was The Soul in Scandinavian Mythology, The Wanderer by Your Side. Blog post by Clara McGowan. In Scandinavian lore, each person was believed to walk through life with a vard, or a guardian spirit, and soul double, whose name comes from vardr, meaning warden or watcher. The vard was more than just a metaphor. It was considered as real as the person it shadowed. Some of the key concepts from this article were guardian and double. So the Vard was tied to the individual soul, often appearing as a flickering light, a familiar figure, or even a shape-shifted form, or Hammer. It could protect the person, guide them, and sometimes appear ahead of them as a forerunner spirit, what Norwegians called Vardogr, and the Finns and E18, or something like that. Basically, different types of Scandinavians call them different things naturally. So these appearances could serve as omens, warnings, or simple signs of presence. Her next point in her blog was roles and omens. So the Vard acted as a protector of luck and well-being, but could also deliver messages through the form of a chill or a sudden itch or unexplained footsteps, were sometimes interpreted as encounters with a roaming soul. Seeing one's own double, however, was usually a dire omen of death. Scary. Her next point was the connections to the other soul concepts, which we will get into more detail here in a minute. So in Norse belief, the soul was multi-part. That's what we're talking about today. So you had the Hugr, the thought or spirit. The Hammer was your shape or form. Philia was a follower, often an animal or a spirit double, linked more to fate. I say that specifically because there's other types of spirit guides or spirit doubles or entities that are helping you spiritually. Okay. And then the Hamingia, which is your personal luck or fortune, often inherited. The Vard overlaps with the Philia as a spirit companion, but while the Philia leaned more toward fate, the Vard was a daily guardian. So you see the difference there. So like the Philia had to do with your fate. The Vard was your daily guardian. Cultural parallels. Similar beings appear across Europe. The Irish have the Fetch, the Scottish the Wraith, and the German Doppelganger. They all reflect the idea of a soul double that can appear apart from the body, often as an omen or a protector. As far as distinguishing if it's an omen or a protector, you'll have to do your research on that, because I was focusing this episode more on the soul complex or the soul matrix than the doppelganger thing. But if enough people request it, I might do an episode on that. We'll see. Next point was the Christian influence. Over time, the Vard was reinterpreted through Christian ideas, splitting into a good guardian angel and an evil tempter spirit. Still, the older concept of a single soul double lingered in folklore. We have a deeper meaning here. The Vard embodies the Norse animistic worldview, where every being and even objects have spirit. It illustrates the belief that the human soul is fluid, it's mobile, and it's multifaceted, capable of traveling beyond the body, warning loved ones, or lingering after death. So in short, so the last little bit, that's the article summary. The Vard is the soul as a companion spirit. Part protector, part omen, part double. It highlights how the Norse saw the self not as one single essence, but as a complex web of spirit parts. Some are deeply personal, others are tied to fate, family, or a place. How do we break it down? Well, depending on who you ask, the soul has anywhere from 4 to 16 or maybe even more parts. Let's explore those different models. Part 2, versions of the soul complex. We'll start with the 4-part model and then we'll move to the increased numbers. Some of you may be familiar with Ocean Kiltoy. He has some really awesome videos on YouTube, and in his video that I will cite later, explains the gifts from the gods, and there's only 4. So this is the 4-part soul model, where you have the hammer, which is the human form or the shape, which was a gift from Lothar, and which is the breath of life, the force of life, the gift from Odin. The Oder, which was the intellectual self, which had 2 parts called the Huger, which is your thought and your conscience. The Huger, which is your thought or conscience, and the Mimi, which is your memory. So if that sounds familiar, it's because Odin's ravens are the personifications of that thought and memory. So you have Heathen and Munin, however you pronounce the things. Lastly, you have the leek, which is the body, the physical shell. The leek wasn't a gift because, as I stated before, we were already here. We already had shape. We just didn't have breath or intellect or memories or thoughts or the ability to move. So that was the 4-part model. We're going to move on to the 8-part model. And it has something in it that I haven't heard before, but I also don't speak any Scandinavian languages, so sometimes it's hard to find translations. But this one is from Johannes, the YouTube channel Norse Magic and Belief. I think I've also seen this one in some books. I just can't remember which books they were. But this is the 8-part model. In the 8-part model, we still have the hammer, the ond, the oder, and there is no leek. On top of those 3 that I mentioned, there's also Sol, which I guess means soul. Don't ask me what it means after that, because I thought all of this was the soul. So that's just me, though. If this is the model that you prefer, that is totally fine, because just like different tribes back in the day had varying beliefs, it's also okay to have varying beliefs in this modern day and age. We're not strict. Your experience is going to determine your beliefs. So moving right along, they had the Ond, Sol as soul. We had Mini, which was memory. Hugr, which is your mind and thoughts. So the difference between the 4-part model is that the older, it had 2 parts, which was the Hugr and the Mini. But in the 8-part model, you have the Hugr and the Mini are 2 separate things. And then the older, which is also a separate thing. And the older has to do with Odin. So it's like your divine inspiration, your frenzy, your passion, and poetry. So those are all things that have to do with Odin. In this version, the hammer is like your skin, your physical form, which isn't far off from the last version. The 4-part model makes it seem that the hammer is more of movement and the ability to move than it is physical form. Because if you remember in the 4-part model, the leek is the physical form. So anyway, in the 8-part model, we have the hammer as physical form. But there's also the Hamingja, which is your luck, essentially. Ancestral luck. It has to do with your web of weird, and we will get deeper into that. Next up, we have the Philia, which is your follower or your protective spirit. Kind of like a Vard. I feel like they can be the same thing, but also can be different things. Because the Philia kind of gets passed along after you die, whereas the Vard, it is the essence of you and your thoughts and your memories. And we'll get a little deeper into that a little later, because I know it sounds kind of like you're talking about the same thing. If you have some type of spiritual entity and one goes to your children or your family or whoever, when you die, why doesn't this other one? And I will explain, but let me get to that. So that was all the 8 parts for the 8-part model. This is a lot. If you need to re-listen to this episode with like a pen and paper, I completely understand. Moving on to the 10-part model. This is summarized from Aritharger's video. He, of course, has Ond, which is the spirit or breath of life, and he explains it as the vibration of the voice that is used in Galdr. So it's not just breathing, but it's the ability to create with your breath, which is really cool. And then, of course, he has the leek, your physical body, your physical form. The Mini, which is memory, but he explains it deeper than just memory and remembering. It's accessing the memories of the past. The phrase, it's in my genes, if you think about that. Or like having the natural ability to play an instrument without effort, like it just comes naturally to you. That is part of your Mini, because it's your ancestral memories, essentially. Then he has the Hugr, which is your consciousness, so your mind, your thoughts, more analytical thinking than abstract thinking. And of course, the hammer. This is where we kind of go into the difference between the leek, which is the physical body, and the hammer, which Aritharger explains it to be the appearance of the leek, not necessarily the leek itself. So it's how others perceive you, directly related to shapeshifting. So where, like in the lore, Odin shapeshifts, right? But his one eye, that presents itself no matter what he shapeshifts into, whether he turns into a man or an animal or something, that eye is always missing. Whereas the leek is the physical body, and using Odin as an example, his hammer might change, but it's how others perceive him. So if he changes into a bear, but he still has that eye is related to the leek, whereas the shape-shifting is related to the hammer. Moving on, we have our Hamingja, which is, as I said earlier, luck, and it can be transferred to family after death. It is your, personally, I believe the Hamingja is the direct line to the web of weird. It's what connects us, because it's our ancestral luck, the way we just like weave upon the web. Or Philia, this is, like I said earlier, it's a follower, a protective spirit, can be an animal, a person, or even a spiritual figure, like an aura or an essence. If you think about like how people have different learning languages and different love languages. It's one of those things that I feel the way that we perceive otherworldly spiritual things can also be different. So some people might connect better with animals or a person. Some people might not connect very well with either of those things on a spiritual level, and it's more of an essence, but it's a familiar essence. So Philias are also associated with shape-shifting or taking on aspects of that figure. And what I mean by that is a really good example that Arith used was taking like the Ulfednar or the Berserkers. They would take on attributes of the animal. It's not that the animal would take on attributes of them. They would take on those attributes and become more like the Philia, whether you believe they literally shapeshift or if they just became like a bear or became like a wolf because of their behaviors and how they moved and acted and fought in battle. Those have to do with becoming more like your Philia, growing in this faith. And the more I research, the more in depth I go, it's really cool seeing all these aspects of your soul and using it to grow from. As Arith explains in his video, this Philia can be passed down through generations if the owner dies before the Philia. However, if the Philia dies before the owner, usually that's a bad sign of danger is on its way to you. That being said, the Philia is also kind of used to like send out your spiritual energy. How the Philia would work in a magical sense is that you would use it in Sather to project a spiritual representation of the owner into the animal to go places that you can't go. So whether you're having a shamanic journey or practicing Sather or doing something like that, or doing a 9 realms meditation where you go to one of the different worlds and maybe you want to protect yourself spiritually and don't go there as your form that you have, that you know, that you can see in the mirror and know what you look like. Maybe you'd rather send a Philia and develop the relationship with the Philia so that you're still safe and you're still protected on a spiritual level. The Philia is a great part of the soul matrix that I think the deeper and better you develop that relationship, the more you'll be able to access those things that have to do more with Sather and traveling and even understanding your dreams better. Some people have very vivid dreams. Some people don't have dreams at all, or they just don't remember them. But it's common that a Philia will present itself in dreams. Moving right along, we have Oder, which, as stated before, very much represents Odin, which makes sense because he's the Allfather and he is the frenzy one. He's where we get our divine inspiration, the passion, expanded consciousness. The Oder helps us travel between the worlds. If you think of like all those aspects of Odin, whether you like him or not, I know there's some controversial things about him, but having all of those things, not only does it mean that we have flaws just like he does, but it means that we also have these abilities that can be very useful when we're trying to understand ourselves on a deeper level. Of course, the Vard, which we talked about, they can manifest after death as a Draugr, which is kind of like a conscious undead, and the Vard appears as an apparition of some sorts. Why I said earlier that the Philia and the Vard kind of go hand in hand. The Philia, when you pass away and you transcend to what's next, the Philia is like an ancestral thing. The Philia will go on to like your next of kin, essentially, or if you don't associate with your family, then it'll be like the closest person to you that needs the help of that Philia. And where it's different is the Vard is used in shamanic work or necromancy. And I don't mean literally bring you back to life. We know that's not a real thing, I don't think. Science is getting really weird lately, so it's kind of confusing on what's possible and what's not. Science aside, we're going back to spirituality here. When it comes to the Vard, essentially after you die and your leak is gone, your physical body is decayed, the Vard is what they would call upon from the afterlife to ask questions or gain wisdom or just say, what's up? How's it going? What's the afterlife like? You know? like I said, it's all of these aspects of you minus the physical body. It's just the spiritual thoughts, the memories, the consciousness, everything that has to do with you after you transcend. I feel like transcend is the wrong word. It kind of makes me sound like I'm talking about like a new age hippie cult. Man, I really hope I don't bother anybody by saying what I just said. But you know what I mean. When we cross that bridge, the threshold of physical life and death. The last thing from the 10-part model of the Norse Soul Complex is the Megan. And I think I'm pronouncing it wrong. So that is your magical power. That's trusting in yourself and your abilities, your capabilities, your power, and not just the gods or the ancestors. Yes, we are pagans. As heathens, back in the day, yes, they worshiped the gods. However, they did a lot of things on their own. It's not one of those religions where we believe that you just pray about it and things will get better. No, we were putting in the work and making decisions to alter our fate that would hopefully make the outcome better. That wasn't just putting our faith in the gods. It was also putting our faith in ourselves. And that Megan, that's that power of resiliency and trusting that you do have the ability within your power, whatever that is, to make things happen for yourself. All right, our last model is the 16-part model. I won't go into as much depth because we've already touched on all these things. And like I said, you might have to re-listen to this episode with a pen and paper and put it in your journal or something because it's a lot. It really is. So anyway, the 16-part model. We have the Ond, which was breath, the Haminga, luck, the Megan, which the reference I used for this 16-part model claims the Megan is like the vital force, which makes sense. I just like Aerith Harger's version better. The Vili or the Vila, which is your will, your willpower. Then you have Hugr, intellect, meaning, memory. Your Older, which is passion, ecstasy, inspiration. Those all make sense because we remember Older has to do with Odin. Philia, which is your guardian spirit. This version added Orlog, which is your personal thread of the web of weird. They also added kinphilia, so it's your connection to your ancestors, whereas the philia is your personal guardian spirit that has to do with fate. The kinphilia is the fate of your kindred or your family and the connection with the past, with your ancestors. And then we have the hammer, which this is your etheric soul skin, and they added the mod, which is your self-consciousness, emotions, your heart. And they also added liter, not liter measurement, but LITR. And that is your color or your hue, like your spiritual aura. And then they also have your Ve, which is the amount of spiritual power you contain. We all know that Githya and Gothi are names of like clergy. It's a clergy title. But this book I read, and it's by Galina Kraskova. It explains that your Githya and Gothi are also parts of your soul because it is referring to the part that is directly connected to the gods. So does that mean everybody is a Githya or Gothi? No, because in our country, you gotta have a license to marry people and probably to do funerals and things like that, life rights. Those require a certain education level. I say education level, I don't mean like high school, college. You don't need a college degree to be that in our faith. Though there are some classes that we offer at TAC that are highly recommended if you would like to be a clergy member. We do have a clergy training program. If you guys have questions on that, just comment and I will answer those in the next video. Anywho, this is the last thing that's on our 16-part soul complex. It is the web of weird, which I can see how the concept is connected to our soul, but I don't think it's inherently a part of the soul. But like I said, that's just me. So the web of weird, for those of you who are newer to these concepts, it's the tapestry in which we move and our connection to the world and our ancestors and the gods. So in ancient times, there wasn't a separation between spirit and physical realms. The web of weird is how we conceptualize it. It explains the 9 realms, where we fit in on it, and all of the runes are contained within the web. Like our thread and how it corresponds with other people's life threads are all weaved together in the web of weird. And that's W-Y-R-D, not W-E-R-D. Wait, not W-E-I-R-D. That weird is also cool and welcome. And like I've been trying to say this whole time, I would like to emphasize that these are interpretive frameworks. There is no right answer, whether you believe in the 4, the 8, the 10, or the 16 model of the Soul Complex. It really doesn't have hard doctrine. It's more or less what works for you. One of my favorite things about the Soul Matrix is how it breaks down all these different aspects of who we are into separate pieces. It's like putting parts of yourself into boxes so you can organize these big, deep concepts. And honestly, as someone with ADHD, it feels really realistic and really helpful. And sometimes I need to zoom in on just one aspect at a time instead of trying to hold the whole picture in my head at once. If you want an even nerdier way to think about it, it's kind of like rolling for a Dungeons and Dragons character. An example would be, so you roll for dexterity and your score is really high, like your hammer or your physical form. But your intelligence or your hugger might be super low. It's kind of funny, but it makes sense because when you have all these different soul parts, it translates to Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop game really well, because I play a character that has really high wisdom but really low intelligence. And I was like, how does that even work? But then when you think about it through the Norse lens of looking through life, it's like, okay, I do see how that makes sense, because how we see the soul, we have things that seem similar, but really they're not. And ever since playing D&D, my life is ruined. I look at everything like everything's D&D now. It's kind of funny, but it makes sense for me in my brain. Each part of the soul has its own stats, its own strengths, and its own weaknesses, and together they make up the whole character sheet of who we are. Which brings us to part 3. Why it matters today in this modern day and age. The Norse Soul Complex is still powerful and relevant today because it gives us a much more layered way of looking at ourselves than what we usually see in modern Western thought. Instead of one single indivisible soul, we've talked about today that the Norse people of the past believed the self was made up of many parts, each with its own role, its own strengths, and its own influence on our fate and legacy. For us today, that means we can use this framework as a tool for reflection and self-growth through ancestor veneration, shadow work, weird, Seidr, and more. The different aspects of the soul, like the hugger or the hminga, or even the philia, can be seen as mirrors for parts of our own psyche. In fact, some people even compare the philia, or the shadow self, to Carl Jung's archetypes. If you want to know more about that, I'll link it in the show notes, which makes it a really useful way to explore and integrate our own inner world. Man, my contacts are dry and I'm hungry. If I look like I'm crying, I'm not. My contacts kept messing up, so I just had to do a little eye squirts of the little eye juice. But anyway, the Soul Complex also reminds us of our place in the bigger picture. With concepts like the hminga, we see that our choices don't just affect us. They ripple forward into future generations and tie us back to those who came before us. By honoring our ancestors, we strengthen our own identity and our sense of belonging. It also gives us a model for resilience and living with integrity. The Norse valued honor, perseverance, adaptability, and courage, virtues that are just as needed now as they were 1,000 years ago. The soul wasn't just about survival. It was about building character and leaving behind a legacy worth remembering. And of course, there's the question about mortality. The ancient Norse saw death not as a simple ending. Emma, what do? The ancient Norse saw death not as a simple ending, but as a transition. To them, memory was kind of immortality. As long as you are remembered, you are still alive. If this concept sounds familiar, it's because it is a fairly common folk belief for many cultures. That perspective encourages us to live more intentionally, to create lives and deeds that will be worth telling long after we're gone. Even now, we see the influence of these ideas in modern pagan practice, where the Norse Soul Complex is used for ritual, meditation, and personal growth. We see it in popular culture, books, movies, video games that keep these themes of fate, heroism, and complexity alive. And academic research is still uncovering new sites from burials and sagas, deepening our understanding of how the Norse thought about mind, body, and spirit. So when we talk about the Norse Soul Complex today, we're not just looking at history. We're looking at a living framework that still has a lot to teach us about who we are and who we're becoming. Today, we've taken a walk through the Norse Soul Complex, looking at how the ancients imagined the many parts of the self, the breath, thought, luck, spirit, memory, and more. What I love about this is that it's not just history. It's something we can still use today, whether it's for ancestral work, shadow work, or just understanding ourselves a little better. It reminds us that we're more than one thing, and our lives ripple into the future and back into the past. And that living with honor and intention is what gives our story real weight. The Norse Soul Complex isn't just old lore. It's a living framework for who we are and who we're still becoming. As you go about your week, take a little time to reflect which parts of yourself feel the strongest right now, which might need a little extra care. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them with us in the AusaTrue community on Facebook or in your own practice. The more we understand these layers of ourselves, the deeper our connection to our path becomes. And in our next episode, we'll shift from exploring the soul to using our hands. We'll talk about crafting, not just as a skill or a hobby, but as a sacred practice that ties us to the gods, our ancestors, and our weird. Thank you for joining me today. Send in your experiences, questions, and stories to podcast@theosatruecommunity.com. My sources for this episode are The Soul in Scandinavian Mythology, The Wanderer by Your Side by Clara McAlphin. From YouTube, we have Jackson Crawford's Soul and Spirit in Old Norse, Ocean Keltoys, The Heathen Image of the Multi-Part Soul, Norse Magic and Beliefs, The 8 Aspects of the Soul/Individual in Norse Pagan Belief, and Aritharger, Norse Spirituality, The Parts of the Self. Lastly, Galina Kraskova's book, A Modern Guide to Heathenry. Until next time, may your hearth stay warm and your frith strong. This has been Fireside Frith, where the flame never dies.